Excellent. Now for the negative summary.
Mr. Speaker, the negative team was very confused. The affirmative team was very confused. The negative team knew just what they were doing. The affirmative team told you that ghettos existed on the fringes of big cities. They told you that rich people like to protect their views. They told you that people thought it was going to be difficult to reprioritise cities and make them smarter and greener. Those were all reasons why if the government didn't intervene and tell those people their incentives right now were wrong, you would never get the kind of sustainable development they wanted. All you would ever get was cities growing out and out in ways that locked people out of the kind of development they wanted while imposing a massive environmental cost. I'm going to ask two questions at the end of the negative case. Firstly, how do we best bring the poor into development? And secondly, how do we best protect the environment? So with that first question, what they didn't understand in this debate was that the rich could only do things like argue for their views, argue for poor people being priced out of a particular area when cities could continue to grow out, when there wasn't a natural limit on how big those cities were or an incentive to create new cities. It was very easy to continue the kinds of pernicious behaviour that they pointed to. We identified very similar benefits for the poor in this debate, so it simply became a question of who achieved those best. We both wanted people to access jobs, to access services, to access politics. But the affirmative gave you much more credible reasons, pointing to cities like Manhattan that had natural limits on growth and were much more socially equal than the cities that they had pointed to. We told you that growing up rather than out meant that people would be physically closer. We pointed to examples of cities like the one that we are in right now, that said when it took you 2 hours to get from the fringe cities that they pointed to, you couldn't really meaningfully do things like access jobs because you were just too far away. We told you that sprawl locked those people out. The further out they went, the less opportunities they had. We thought that even if you got new cities, you created an incentive to diversify those economies. So you got the things like Laura wanted, of having lots of job opportunities, when you said to people that they had to go to different places in order to get them, rather than crowding into one single physical space. Why would density or small cities happen? We gave you lots of reasons. Firstly, that these people were still voters. Nick gave you the example of populist movements in India. There was very little response to this from the affirmative team, despite it coming out in my speech and consistently down the bench. We told you that it combated inertia and consequences that weren't there right now. We told you that it combated the pernicious cultural idea of the wealthy, that they should have big backyards, that you should aspire to a quarter-acre block, because we said there was only a certain amount of space and you should just get an apartment. We took the land out of the hands of developers and put it into the hands of the government. So the consent they pointed to was insufficient because we had better information that could signal to people that they should leave Shanghai and go to places like Beijing instead. Second question, how do we best protect the environment? It was telling that in Laura's speech they said that they would sacrifice the environment for social development. I've already shown you that that is unnecessary, but why is the environment important in this debate? We told you that the environment was unique and irreplaceable, that lots of cities had done things like cut into forests to create more housing. Even if you bought their analysis that that was not the case now, the logical consequence of their policy was that cities would keep growing and eventually hit those places that had huge consequences, like driving animals into the cities, spreading disease, doing things that made housing less secure. They told you that large cities that we wanted, that were more dense, created environmental pressure. We told you that it created innovation. Things like public transport routes were more accessible when you were all within one common space. We told you that things like cultural integration were better when you couldn't shove the poor away, but had things like Chinatown and Little Italy all within the one city and people were constantly exposed to them. The affirmative didn't want to engage with the importance of this land. That was something that was significant in this debate because we didn't want green belts to be arbitrary. We wanted them to protect land that was environmentally important. This was land that once it was gone and in the hands of developers was not something that you could get back. These guys mischaracterised this debate and misunderstood the importance of these green belts. We created the social equality they wanted at much less of a social cost, and that's why the motion should fall.
And for the final speech of the debate, invite Richard with
Mr. Speaker, we found it confusing because these guys were okay with building over the environment outside of cities, provided that they weren't the big cities. These guys were okay with giving people access to economic opportunities, provided they weren't the opportunities that those people actually wanted in Bangkok and KL. We thought that that was ludicrous. I've got two issues in response. Firstly, what is better for economic development and people? And secondly, do we get environmental harm or worsen environmental harm? So firstly, what is better for economic development and people? And what we told you all across our bench was that poor people actively want to live in these cities for economic and personal reasons, because it's important for their identity and how they access other rights. There was no response to the idea of their identity. Secondly, we said that it oppresses financial and education outcomes because there was an increased barrier to entry to get into this city. What they told us, though, was that that was just the market signalling that there are no jobs for you. We thought that the market was probably a better way of signalling whether there are no jobs for you than the government, Mr. Speaker. We thought that the fact that wages were higher in the city was a pretty good signal that there were jobs in the city, Mr. Speaker. Then we said that it oppresses political power when you leave people out in rural areas or you put them in these ghettos that they want. What we heard from Abigail is that when you put people within these cities in high-density housing, that means people share space and poor and wealthy people cooperate and gain a sense of shared identity. What we thought is that rich people would view this as being a cost to them because you are reducing their views, you're reducing the price of their house because they are in a poorer area. We thought that created a hostile environment which further incentivized those wealthy people to work against those better outcomes for the poor people. But what happened when you created a suburb on the outskirts of that city where poor people could live together was they could politically organise and they could lobby for better access to that suburb and they could lobby for better jobs in a way that wasn't antagonistic to the wealthy people. What they said, though, was you could get all of these developments by building up. We told you, however, that that was not viable and why that wasn't viable. Laura and I said that it was politically unsustainable because people don't like their views being ruined and there were limits on infrastructure. Moreover, if you did build up, you just got those ghettos which denied economic opportunities to those people. Then what we told you was that it's better for workers' bargaining power in rural areas because they aren't stuck in the rural area, they can threaten to move. What they said was that small cities create competitive labour markets. We never understood why. If you lived in a city, you have more employers that can potentially employ you. Your labour market is necessarily more competitive and you can push for better conditions. Secondly, do we get environmental harm? Mr. Speaker, we thought that the most important thing to do in this debate was to help the poor people. But even on the basis of environmental protection, we don't think we cause any significant damage because you can protect the environment through other things. Things like national parks and things like that. But this didn't protect the environment because people still disturbed these areas. They lived on the borders of these areas and let their pets and livestock run around in them. What they said was they didn't support those types of green belts. But this ignored my material on how this was necessarily the case, Mr. Speaker, because people with political power just made the green belts where they wanted to protect their views and their environment. It's noted that governments had an incentive to keep people out of these cities. There were no assessments. It was incredibly arbitrary. They provided no reason for us to think that the incentives of people choosing where green belts are would change. But then they said that they would just build extra cities or expand existing cities. This was the most confusing line of their analysis, because what they said, unless they were going to keep some rural village to the small size as it always was that they would build over the environment surrounding those cities to expand the size of those cities. Moreover, you can increase environmental damage through shipping between cities, and we thought that was harmful and antithetical to the case. Mr. Speaker, we got better development and outcomes for people. The environment wasn't sufficiently harmed. We're proud to propose.